Good afternoon and welcome to the Miller Center and the Democratic Statecraft Lab at the University of Virginia. I'm Todd Sexer and I'm a professor in the Department of Politics here at UVA, a senior fellow at the Miller Center and the director of the Statecraft Lab. From time to time, we like to hold events here that are focused on important books that have been published about US foreign policy and international politics. We understand that not everyone has the time to keep up with the latest cutting edge research taking place in the academy. So we are here to bring that research straight to you. And for our final event of the fall semester today, we will be talking about a provocative and important new book titled The Myth of the Nuclear Revolution, written by Keir Lieber of Georgetown University and Daryl Press of Dartmouth College. You would think more than 75 years after the invention of nuclear weapons, that we would now have a pretty good understanding of how nuclear weapons shape foreign policy and international politics. But this book argues that actually this is not the case, that in fact we've misunderstood the meaning of the nuclear revolution, and that the consequences of the spread of nuclear weapons are actually much different than we had thought. To lead the conversation today, we're fortunate to have with us Dale Copeland, professor of politics here at UVA and a senior fellow at the Miller Center. Dr. Copeland is the author of two important books on the causes of war, as well as numerous journal articles on diplomacy, trade, and international security. So enjoy the conversation, and Dale, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Todd, and I'm going to be trying to do a difficult task in a way of trying to mediate a debate and conversation between Keir Lieber and Daryl Press on the book itself, get the debate going. But then after about perhaps 20 minutes, I'm going to have the audience with its Q&A questions run the show, if you will, and I'll try to mediate those questions and I encourage everybody to send your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Keir Lieber and Daryl Press have written a very important new book, and I'm not going to talk much about it. I'm going to let them have about 5, maybe 10 minutes to introduce it themselves. But what they've done here is challenge one of the big assumptions that has animated at least the academic research for some 50 years, namely that nuclear weapons created a major revolution in international politics. And by revolution, what is usually meant is that nuclear weapons, because they make major war or territorial war not insignificant, but very costly, and therefore war doesn't pay, we should expect a change in great power behavior, but also the behavior of regional states that have nuclear weapons. They should be more cautious, they should be more deterred, and overall, there should not be the kind of great power politics, arms racing, competition for allies, competition for territory that we saw prior to the nuclear revolution, that is, prior to 1945. And so I'm not going to talk too much about the book itself, except to say that it has important implications for the current debate about U.S.-China. China having revealed recently, or at least through satellites, we have come to know that they are building more ICBM sites. They have also apparently launched or tested a hypersonic weapon that can evade missile defenses. And there are reasons to believe that the U.S.-China competition is heating up in a big way, not just in regional politics, but perhaps also at the nuclear level. So that makes this book an extremely significant one. The authors are somewhat pessimistic about this future, and they believe that states do strive for nuclear superiority, or at least nuclear parity that they can use in a coercive way. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to them, give them about 5-7 minutes or so, maybe more if they want, and then I will ask a few starting questions, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So Keir and Daryl, why don't you guys start it off?
Hey, thank you, Dale. Let me start. I'm going to introduce the book, and then Keir and I will both participate in the discussion that follows. Let me first start by thanking the Miller Center, thanking the Democratic Statecraft Lab, and also thanking Todd and for Dale for kicking off this conversation. We look forward to this. Let me start with two facts. I think they're facts about the nuclear age. Number one, that nuclear weapons appear to be very effective instruments of deterrence. And when I say that, what I mean is nuclear armed countries seem to be very reluctant to fight each other for good reason. You'll note that in the 100 years prior to the invention of nuclear weapons, there were 5 great power wars. In the 75 years since, we've had 0. So that doesn't in and of itself prove that nuclear weapons were the factor, but I think we can make that argument using other evidence. So let me just start with what I would call fact number one, which is nuclear weapons are in fact powerful instruments of deterrence. Fact number two is that they have not had many of the other effects on international politics that seem to follow logically from their impressive deterring power. And in fact, other changes which scholars of the nuclear revolution repeatedly claimed they expected to happen. Namely, what do I mean? If the mere possession of nuclear weapons makes nuclear war so unlikely, then you wouldn't expect to see so much nuclear arms racing. Because once you have a few of them, and once you have 100 of them, the race is over, it's a tie. If nuclear weapons' mere existence meant that major power war was nearly impossible to win and therefore senseless and therefore it wasn't going to happen, you wouldn't see such intense efforts to achieve conventional force dominance in the nuclear age, especially by the major nuclear armed states. Similarly, the nuclear age shouldn't be an age in which the big, powerful countries were so suspicious and so focused on the relative power increases of potential rivals, what political scientists call relative gains concerns. And if nuclear weapons had changed the world as much as nuclear revolution theorists expect, alliances might still be important for trade for some reasons, but they wouldn't have had the same geopolitical salience in the nuclear era that they did in the decades and centuries beforehand. But the reality, as we all know, is that the nuclear age, the first 2/3 of the nuclear age, was characterized by the Cold War, a competition of incredible intensity that included an intense nuclear arms race, an intense conventional arms race, a scramble for alliances all around the globe, and constant concern on both sides about trends and relative gains. All things that the logic of this robust nuclear deterrence and the nuclear revolution say shouldn't have happened, and which advocates of the nuclear revolution said shouldn't be happening. Leaders should relax, they said. And of course, in the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen this begin to play out again, with intense relative gains concerns between the US and China, a very significant conventional arms race, and now a nuclear arms race between the two sides, which, to be honest, has been going on for 15 years, but finally has been fully enjoined by the Chinese. All right, so what's going on here? The puzzle that our book is intending to answer is why both of these facts together are occurring. Namely, why is it that nuclear weapons are so good at deterring war, and yet they haven't convinced the major powers in the world who possess them to relax and not prepare so hard and intensely for those wars that seem so unlikely? Our answer to this focuses us on the nature of stalemate. I began this by saying nuclear weapons are one of the most effective instruments of deterrence ever made. The way they do so is by creating the condition of stalemate, in which no side has a reasonable hope of winning a war. But if you want to understand why both sides of this puzzle are true, they deter so well and yet people compete so hard, you have to dive into the nature of stalemate. And that's what the book, Keir's and my book, does. So let me focus on 3 aspects of stalemate that explain why international competition in the nuclear age has remained so intense. Number 1, stalemate is actually hard to create, and it results from a competitive process. When a country acquires nuclear weapons, it then almost instantly begins to race to build them up enough to make sure that they're secure and survivable and can't be destroyed. But its enemies also begin to race and build up capabilities to try to keep the nascent nuclear arsenal vulnerable and therefore to prevent stalemate. This is what you saw in the 1950s in the Cold War. The Soviets racing to create stalemate, the United States racing to prevent them from acquiring it. It's what you've seen in the last 15 years in the Korean Peninsula. Nuclear-armed North Korea desperately trying to create a survivable second strike force. The United States and South Korea arms racing to prevent that from happening. So the point is that nuclear acquisition does not tend to reduce competition. It tends to exacerbate it. Number two, once countries get over the bar and establish a force which is survivable, they create stalemate, the race is not over. Because nuclear stalemate is a two-way street. So as soon as they establish a condition of stalemate, they begin to worry, what if our enemy is going to build out of stalemate and build the kind of capabilities that could destroy our nuclear force? And they start to arms race to prevent that. Or maybe they get tempted to try to create that advantage over their rivals. This dynamic, the attempt to escape from stalemate, is what explains the last 25 years of the Cold War, from about 65 to 90. As the United States and Soviets are locked in stalemate, but the United States in particular was arms racing to try to escape by trailing Soviet subs, by increasing the accuracy of its weapons, by deploying stealth bombers, by breaking into Soviet nuclear command and control. It also explains what's been going on in the US-China rivalry of the past decade, as the United States tries to ensure it has a first strike capability over China, as China tries to scramble to avoid that. Finally, issue number three about stalemate is even when stalemate exists, countries often seek to use nuclear threats to deter non-nuclear attacks on them. And to do this actually ends up requiring a lot of nuclear capability, a lot of command and control capability, and the kind of capabilities which trigger other types of arms racing. All right, I want to stop and open this up for conversation. So let me just kind of put three ideas quickly on the table with regard to implications. The analysis that Keir and I did was not merely trying to solve a puzzle that, frankly, even the scholars of the theory of the nuclear revolution acknowledge. They begin their books by asking why the nuclear age has not played out the way that their theory says. And they explain it by saying, dumb political leaders are getting things wrong. We actually show the logic of what the political leaders are doing and why it has not turned out. But what does this mean for geopolitics today? Three quick ideas to put on the table, and then we can talk about them in Q&A. One of them is this explanation, this argument we're making, explains why, unfortunately, we should see nuclear arms races continue to flourish around the world. Why the United States is not surprisingly building up its nuclear capabilities, even as it restrains its numbers. Why North Korea is doing the same thing. While South Korea is doing it with an asterisk, they're building up conventional counterforce capabilities and hedging for a nuclear future. While China's fully thrown its lot in this way, why Russia is too. Number two, our analysis explains why future nuclear cuts are not only unlikely, unfortunately, but unfortunately they become dangerous. That the whole premise of nuclear arms reduction in the Cold War was largely sensible because it was based on the idea that you could reduce numbers from these vast Cold War arsenals and leave every side as secure or more secure. But in a world with much smaller arsenals, much more accurate weapons, revolutionary ISR, and conventional weapons that can disarm nuclear attacks, arms cuts at this point are not only unlikely, they're dangerous. Lastly, our argument explains why proliferation will continue to be one of the most central national security problems for the 21st century. Because unfortunately, the acquisition of nuclear weapons, whether it's by North Korea, by South Korea, by Iran, will not end the rivalries in those regions, as some nuclear revolution analysts expected, but rather will trigger a new era of more dangerous competition. So I hope that we've given you enough to play with and to think through, and we welcome questions and discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Daryl. And what I'm going to try to do is create a debate between the three of us for maybe 15, 20 minutes, partly to allow Keir and Daryl to talk a little bit more about their particular arguments and specific support, but also, of course, just to get a chance to push it to a higher level so that we can see some of the dimensions of the argument that might not be clear just from a short presentation. So I'm going to start off by trying to be provocative, and Daryl and Keir, perhaps you can unmute yourself right away so you can respond as soon as you want to. But here's the point that I would probably start with, which is that I feel there's a bit of a bait and switch, or not a bait and switch, but a false dichotomy between what might be called extreme believers in the nuclear revolution, that, a bare minimum of nuclear weapons is enough. It gets you deterrence. You've got to secure a second strike, perhaps with a minimum. Even France's nuclear force might be considered that. And therefore, the expectation of the so-called competing school that you're going against simply says, hey, enough is enough. Why do more? And then, yes, you're right. They often start their books by saying they're doing a lot more than we expect. This is puzzling. But you then create, or at least you leave out, a middle ground position by arguing, I see, as arguing that there has been a great deal of security competition from 1945 onwards, right to the present day, and that's really just sort of old school geopolitics, perhaps from the offensive realist side, which says that within an anarchic system, you always have to compete and compete strongly. And so there's this sense that I have from reading the book that there is no middle ground here, middle ground position. And the middle ground position would go something like this. It would say, yes, we agree that in certain areas there's still an intense security competition. And indeed, a lot of your evidence is a competition in terms of doctrines or plans for war if war occurs, where you see this kind of intense effort to survive a nuclear war, and the planning that went through the 50s and 60s right up to the end of the Cold War really did emphasize so-called counterforce attacks on missile sites, an attempt to win a nuclear war if it were to occur. And then you, at least in one of the chapters, use this evidence about strategic plans as evidence that, hey, it's just good old-fashioned geopolitics. And you do this in other ways as well, where you talk a lot about the postures that states have, namely, essentially doctrines. What would they do if there were to be a crisis? India, for example, a crisis with Pakistan, or Pakistan vice versa. But the real guts of the middle ground position is to focus on behavior, actual policies, actual diplomacy, and to say that in the middle here, there is a lot of caution. There is a difference, a big difference, namely that while you might have plans for war and winning it with nuclear weapons, in your actual day-to-day behavior, you're going to be much more cautious. And in fact, what we have now is what we might call nuclear chicken games, where if you know the chicken game of the teenagers facing each other, they don't want the actual crash, but they're willing to sort of push their weight around. Well, in a nuclear chicken, it's not just a crash where you might walk away with a sore arm or a broken leg. This is the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people on both sides, and millions of people on both sides. And that makes for a difference. That's the middle ground position. That makes behavior different. It makes the United States quite cautious in expressing itself regarding NATO. Soviets are cautious. There hasn't been, for example, a nuclear standoff since 1962, and even in 61, when there was a brief tank confrontation, the superpowers have never really met face to face on a battlefield scenario. And this is what needs to be explained, the cautiousness of the behavior, not the sort of sometimes pretty extreme security plans or plans for war, but the actual diplomacy. So I want you to address this issue, that the middle ground, or the position that I would believe most scholars and people in the policy world would adopt, is that it does make a huge difference. There is a revolution because you can't think about using war as a true instrument.
Okay, thank you, Daryl. If it's okay, let me kick us off. Thank you to Todd. Thank you, Dale. Thank you to Miller Center. Thank you to Statecraft Project Lab. Sorry. Look, you mentioned a bunch of different things. I'm tempted to try and tackle everything, but let me just take a couple of dimensions of this. I mean, it's interesting. People have a tendency to see their own view as always being in the middle ground. I mean, in a way, Daryl and I would probably say, well, hey, we have the middle position in all of this, right? Because on the one hand, we say nuclear weapons are the greatest deterrent, that humans have ever created to war. And yet at the same time, we're criticizing this notion that somehow they transform international relations. So, we kind of think our own position is quite reasonable and in the middle ground, but that's the way it is. One of the things we do in the book is we don't say that you have to have an extreme belief in nuclear weapons. In fact, we lay out a range of different views about deterrence, ranging from existential deterrence, which is basically the view that you described. Once you have the bomb, you're going to reap the benefits of deterrence. You don't need much more. Just literally a bomb in the basement will do the job. There are some people who believe that is how deterrence works. Others say it's more about minimum deterrence. You build more, you train to use nuclear weapons, but you still don't need a whole lot. Yet others look for assured retaliation, so that no matter what happens, you'll always have the ability to retaliate. And others look at assured destruction as the kind of threshold for deterrence, that not only do you have to be guaranteed to respond, but guaranteed to respond with a devastating amount of force. And what we do in one of the first empirical chapters is to look at how U.S. behavior, and that's what the term that you just used, changed in response to the growth of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, right? So just take a step back. We don't have any evidence. Nuclear weapons have only been used, once or twice, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it's not a great case because Japan didn't have nuclear weapons themselves. So you can't really tell a whole lot about deterrence from that. The only thing that we can look at in the Cold War example is when was the United States, much more reluctant to rely on nuclear weapons to achieve its security objectives. And for those of you, very few people at Virginia don't know their history on this one, but the United States was prepared to use nuclear weapons early and often in a conventional war with the Soviet Union in order to deter an attack on Western Europe and to bring it to a halt before it was too late. What we show in the chapter is that as the Soviet arsenal, went through the different phases of an existential deterrent to a minimal deterrent to an assured retaliatory capability, assured destruction, the key changes in U.S. behavior didn't occur until assured retaliation. So a bomb in the basement did not do it, did not deter the United States from relying on nuclear weapons. So we point to real behavior and real changes, even if it's not, nuclear war or the absence of. I will simply say that even among the nuclear revolutionists, the views differed. Robert Jervis, for example, was much more of a kind of assured retaliation or a secure second strike kind of person. Kenneth Waltz, probably more along the minimum deterrence spectrum. The last thing I'll say is about plans. Look, in the Cold War, the United States had one plan, for nuclear use. And even when it begins to change, it doesn't change that often. In other words, it's quite fair to say, hey, military plans are just plans. But when in dark times, a president or a military staff is going to do something different. Well, in this case, there was just one plan, and that was to rely on nuclear escalation to deter, and if deterrence failed, to coerce a stalemate to a conflict with the Soviet Union before it was too late. And it was remarkably consistent across presidential administrations, far more than one might have expected.
Well, let me jump in here a little bit, because I think the issue on the table that at least I'm the one I'm pushing for is that there's two different types of dependent variables, things we're trying to explain here. One is the kinds of great power behavior, in particular great power, regional behavior as well, but great power behavior and whether it's different from the pre-45 period. And indeed, is there going to be a repeat of the kind of in your face, we might take your homeland, we might attack the system kind of approach that we saw in 1914, 1939, and that made, conventional powers like France and Britain so worried about a Germany. Well, that seems to be so different. You admit in the book that major war is extremely unlikely, except by an inadvertent escalation. So great powers there have changed. Their behavior is fundamentally more cautious. The second thing is, how does that affect regional elements? Would you be more likely to escalate a regional conflict knowing that you don't want major war between homelands? You bring in the so-called stability-instability paradox and say, well, yeah, you are more likely, or perhaps you are. Some cases you are. And then you bring in this idea of coercive nuclear escalation as, quote, a good thing, or at least a thing you can use rationally. And yet it very much ignores the major point that almost all scholars I know accept, that regional conflicts are also tend to be more low-key, cautious, because you don't want to have the deaths of Russians and Americans over Cuba. You don't want to have Chinese being killed in the South China Sea, because it might escalate all the way up to the nuclear level. Even tactical or regional nuclear weapons would be very scary to both sides. And that creates behavioral changes, diplomacy changes. So to refer to war plans in the 60s as being very much about winning war, that's irrelevant in many ways to the actual behavior. And now here's the kicker. You guys pick, you might say, moments of intense conflict. We did have that Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. What about Détente? What about the effort to reduce nuclear weapons? SALT I, SALT II, START. And what about the very fact that when the Cold War ended, or at least by 1980, there were about 60,000 nuclear weapons on both sides. And then, as you note in your book, that went down to about 6,000 on both sides. So 60,000 in total to 12,000 in total. How did that come about? Why is that not an interesting, important fact for you? You turn it around and then use that so-called fact, it is a fact, 12,000 nuclear weapons in total, and say, oh, well, that gives a low baseline, so there's going to be more competition on the upside. Yeah, we can grant that, but you haven't explained why the two greatest powers, nuclear powers in the world, decided not to compete all out in the way that you're presenting. This is not an offensive realist world. It's a world much more like defensive realism, which says you worry about escalation spirals, you worry about the probability of war going up because of your own aggressive and perhaps assertive behavior. There you go. Thanks.
Let me take a step back. I mean, it's a great question. There's a lot in the book. It took years for Keir and me to wrap our heads around it. But let me kind of try to get you to think about what we're arguing in a slightly different way. When you read it, it seemed that what came out to you, Dale, and yeah, it's fair, is to say what we were saying is everything is the same. And you're pointing out in a very, very nice but strong way, saying everything is the same except for this one most important thing, which is the caution and the actual lack of war. And that's what's hugely different. But actually, let me urge you to think about our argument differently. The fundamental point of our argument is not that everything is the same, is that there are these two poles and they seem in conflict with each other, which is there's the non-war side of the nuclear effect of nuclear weapons. And that's the caution you're talking about, Dale. And that's the caution that's led to 75 years of peace between nuclear armed states, nuclear peace and conventional peace. And that's real. And that's not an asterisk to our argument or something we have to explain away. Our argument is, on one hand, they create exactly what you just said, caution and war reluctance. And at the same time, as Jervis and Waltz and Glazer and a million of other people pointed out, while countries are so cautious and war reluctant, they're building up and preparing as if nothing's changed. And so our question is, why are they both true? And hold on one second, hold on. And the answer as to why they're both true is, whereas contemporary scholars in the 50s and 60s thought that the US arms racing in the 1950s was just a military industrial complex and irrationality. What we now know is throughout the 1950s, we believed we could win a nuclear war. And we were building the capability to extend that duration of US nuclear supremacy as long as possible. As Bob Jervis and Ken Waltz and Charlie Glazer and whatever else wrote in the 70s and 80s, they said, well, why are we still arms racing? Because there's no possible way of beating the Soviets. What none of those scholars working outside of classified materials understood, but which Austin Long and Brendan Green and a bunch of historians of the nuclear age are now discovering after you, Dale, and I and Keir finished graduate school, they're now discovering that the logic of the arms race from a US perspective in the 70s and 80s was not overkill. It was escaping mad. And what Jervis and Waltz and Glazer just dismissed as an impossibility, it wasn't impossible. And in fact, by the end of the Cold War, the Soviets thought the United States was there. So what Keir and I are doing is not imperiled by this observation that nuclear weapons create great caution and war aversion. We agree. What we're trying to do is provide the strategic explanation why, in the face of what you said being true, there's great war aversion, they've still been competing like lunatics, or they've been competing intensely. And the answer is they weren't competing intensely.
That's just not true. You can't go from 30,000 aside in 1980, 30,000 nuclear weapons to 5,000, and believe that this is competing like lunatics.
Why did the numbers, Dale? Why did the numbers matter? Shouldn't we be judging capabilities? And
because you often say in the book that more is better.
No, Dale. What you're saying doesn't make sense. Wait a second. Until 1989, when the Soviets disintegrated, we were vastly increasing our counterforce capabilities in about 5 or 6 different ways. Scholars who were teaching you, me, and Keir didn't know about this. And it came out after the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, the Soviets were on their knees and needed to reduce their nuclear arsenal. And we were happy to go along with arms reduction deals that would do that. All the while, we were spending hundreds of billions of dollars improving our counterforce capabilities while we were reducing numbers. So 1990 through 2005 was the Soviets and then Russians disarming at the nuclear level because they were knocked out. And rather than celebrate and declare victory, we were trying to lock in our counterforce superiority through about 6 different things. And again, this isn't just Keir and Daryl. This is a whole new wave of nuclear scholarship.
Okay, good. I do need to get on with the Q&A part of this, which is the last 25 minutes. We've got an interesting question here. I'm going to put my reading glasses on. We've got an interesting question from Fritz Heinzen. He says there are fascinating and provocative arguments. However, might your arguments be too U.S. and Western allied in terms of its approach? How would the Soviet nuclear strategists look at your arguments? Does this carry over to the post-USSR Russia?
Here, let me jump on this first. I think actually Soviet analysts, they don't like this way of talking, but they entirely agree with how we describe the Cold War, which is, although Keir and I think that the Soviets were the aggressors geopolitically, the nuclear competition was all about America on top and trying to remain on top and trying to get back on top. And that is very much how the Soviets saw it, and we just think it's true. The best critique of what Keir and I are describing about how the nuclear age has played out is to say there's an alternative hypothesis. And the alternative hypothesis is that Keir and I have described American behavior, not the behavior of nuclear weapon states per se. That everybody else learned the real lesson of the nuclear revolution, and only America got it wrong. I would say, and we can talk details, that Russian fears of US nuclear superiority in the 1980s, Russian fears of US nuclear superiority in the last 15 years, and China's evident fear of US nuclear superiority, which has led to their substantial increases in the last 15 years, are evidence that it's not just an American view, that the resource-rich big players in the nuclear realm understand. It's not that Keir and Daryl are right. They understand that the policymakers who've been playing the geopolitical game of nuclear competition since 1945 have a good point. And those two countries are struggling to try to get out of this condition of U.S. nuclear superiority. Keir.
Yeah, just quickly to jump in because Dale, you referred to inadvertent escalation in a conventional war. That's not our term. That's your term because it reveals again the view of defensive realists and pretty Western-centric view that anybody who would use a nuclear weapon in a war is crazy, irrational, delusional. Okay. In the book, of course, we talk about a country like North Korea and Kim Jong-un. It may be that he's crazy, but you don't need to assume that kind of irrationality or inadvertence to imagine why a country like North Korea, which is conventionally inferior in relationship to the United States and South Korea, might be willing to use nuclear weapons in a coercive fashion in the midst of a conventional war before it's utterly defeated. That is a non-Western, again, Americans find it hard to believe. Why would anybody use nuclear weapons? Look how many nuclear weapons we have. But it totally undermines the logic of the nuclear revolution, and it undermines the kind of defensive realist view that it's all about a misunderstanding and a spiral of misunderstanding that somehow leads to conflict instead of the reality of international politics.
I'll just say that it's not a question of defensive realism and spiral modelers, people who look at escalation scenarios as being, first of all, seeing any possibility of nuclear weapon use as irrational. What they're saying is that there's an inherent downside to the kind of competition that you're talking about. And this is not actually brought into the book. But let me go to a question from Miller Center fellow Spencer Backage. If competition is a puzzle for the nuclear revolution school, is the stability of a strategic deterrence now a puzzle for your framework? In other words, do you have ideas about how competition to escape MAD transforms into stable deterrence? In a way, I think Spencer is asking a slightly different way of expressing my view that we did learn something from the late 70s, early 80s competition. We learned that maybe Kissinger and Nixon were right to try to get on the stabilization program. And then we had START 1, START 2, which brought the number of nuclear weapons down, but also tried to stabilize other aspects of the competition. SDI obviously went out the window with Clinton. We have some national missile defense, but the idea of a full-blown national missile defense was seen as very problematic for the stability. And I think Spencer's talking about that. What about the efforts to create stable deterrence?
Okay, I'll let Daryl, jump in too, but just there are too many historians around the University of Virginia to allow you to get away with a description of Kissinger and Nixon as being focused on stabilization in the arms control period.
I'm talking about ABM. ABM.
As you know, the cutting edge research on this period shows quite clearly, by John Moore and others, shows quite clearly that the competition within the administration between those who you might describe as stabilizers and deterrence and those seeking advantage, of which Nixon and Kissinger were clearly in this category, was won by the Nixon-Kissinger group, and that they thought that these deals, including arms control negotiations, would free up MIRV capabilities, counterforce capabilities for the United States. The United States never took its foot off the pedal to the metal on the counterforce competition, and the fruits of our labor really emerged at the end of the Cold War. This is why in the 1990s you have B-2 bombers and stealth technology and all kinds of other capabilities and nuclear guidance, et cetera, really come to fruition. That didn't just happen. It wasn't just kind of bureaucratic inertia that led to that. I think Spencer's question is an excellent one. I don't have an answer to offer about how does this competition and when does competition actually result in stability. But I think our point, and the point we make at the end of the book, is look, what we're trying to say is deterrence is not automatic. It's not easy. And it's wrong to assume that once countries acquire nuclear weapons, that things will be relatively stable. It's wrong to let expertise in nuclear strategy wither on the vine. right? To eliminate courses on nuclear weapons and things like that because they don't really matter or they're obsolete. This is a serious business, and we need to treat it seriously and figure out what it takes to build a deterrent arsenal, not just for the United States, but for all nuclear countries.
Let me just jump in on this point too. Keir said it well, so I won't say much. I will just say, I would advise anyone interested in this to also read Brendan Green's new book, which points out, and this is not just correlational data, this is process tracing data based on the declassified discussions in the US side. US arms control strategy in the 70s and 80s the strategy was to turn the competition from one of numbers to one of technology. So by limiting numbers, the balance of capability would hinge on who had the better technology, which is where we would win. And our better ASW, our quieter subs, our more accurate weapons, our better ISR, and our early cyber capabilities and EW capabilities would give us an advantage. That is explicitly how multiple US administrations in the 70s and 80s viewed it. So I don't see any story here that says that we had found a path toward stability. On the great question, which is the key policy question, which is, well, then what do we do in this nuclear world? A world in which none of us want a nuclear war. How do you get stability? I think the answer is kind of like the answer that we are faced with when we're thinking about conventional forces, which is if there's a conflict you have with another country and tensions are high and war seems plausible and they have a lot of capability, you simply need a lot of capability, redundant capability. And so as the United States thinks about modernizing its force, as the United States, let me say it this way, when Keir and I try to think about what this ultimately means about how do you safely practice nuclear deterrence, one of the ways we've talked about this is to say nuclear deterrence is just way too serious a business to do on the cheap, to do on the simple, or to do just enough. That frankly, maybe we're better off getting rid of nuclear weapons if the alternative is to have a small, poorly funded, barely capable nuclear force. If you're really going to hold hundreds of millions of people's lives at risk, if you're going to really rest so much on nuclear deterrence, if you understand the findings from Keir's in my book, which is that others are going to be working hard to neutralize your nuclear capabilities all the time, then the answer is you want redundancy. You want redundant types of delivery systems, you want redundant types of weapons, you want dispersion, you want all these things that we and others are going to be tempted to get rid of in an era of reduced budget. So whether you're taking this message from the standpoint of a US planner or a Chinese planner or a North Korean planner or a Russian planner, if you want non-use of nuclear weapons, I would say cross your T's, dot your I's, don't do it on the cheap, don't do it on the minimal, build redundant capabilities.
Yeah,
because otherwise,
let me go to another question just to make sure I get through them in the next 5 minutes, or 10 minutes, really. I want to leave the last 4 or 5 minutes for wrap-up points. We have a question from Gary Donato, who identifies himself as a retired nuclear weapons officer with submarine launch ballistic missiles. I'm going to see if I can paraphrase the question just for the general audience. He asks, what would be more germane to the argument that you're making here? An individual level analysis, which in political science terms means persons, individual leaders, people who actually think this way or don't think this way, as the focal point for your book, or a more game theoretical approach that would look at stalemate within sort of a more structural perspective, not individual leaders like a Nixon or Kissinger, but a more game theoretical perspective that says there's a structure that hangs over the actors and constrains or maybe shapes and propels their behavior. And he has a separate point, but maybe I can just focus on that one for a second, because it does strike me that one of the things that has come through in so much of the literature is that prior to 45, prior to the nuclear revolution, or prior to the advent of nuclear weapons, a lot of games, even in the core of a territory or a system, such as Europe, were what we call prisoner's dilemma games, where yes, you had an incentive sort of take the other for a sucker, But if the other was going to try to take you for a sucker or try to get an advantage on you, you would go to war. You would go to a small war, perhaps, like the Crimean War, or you'd go to an all-out war like 1914. And that after nuclear weapons, especially after 1963 and the scare of the 1962 crisis, there was a clear sense that almost every game theoretical situation that great powers face was a nuclear chicken game. That it wasn't, you weren't able to attack each other's homelands, but you also didn't want to have direct great power war over peripheral territories because of the potential for a crash in the chicken game sense, which would lead to, hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions dying. So I think that's part of what I see in this question is this sense of the structure being different, game theoretically, or whether this is really about individuals perhaps sometimes doing stupid things from the nuclear revolution school, or perhaps doing stupid things from your school, like going to a Start 1, Start 2, or getting rid of ABM, or not going full force with your national missile defense. Thanks.
So I'll just offer and I'll try and be very brief because you're right, we do not have much time. Number one, I think that the analogy to nuclear chicken is actually not useful. I mean, I appreciate it. I certainly understand it. As having 4 daughters, 3 of whom are drivers, I'm constantly worried about a bored Saturday night here in Bethesda, Maryland, playing chicken on the road. But the problem with the analogy, which emerges from Powell's work and Schelling even on stalemate, is that it assumes that any use of nuclear weapons would be the equivalent of 2 cars crashing into each other head on a highway going at a high rate of speed. And I think and it tries to then analyze, reputational effects and intensity of preferences and things like that as the real way to solve this game and who's going to win. And I think that is a problem because states contemplate using nuclear weapons without fearing that it will end in automatic all-out nuclear war, which is again what you need to make that chicken kind of analogy. I think the bigger point here is that clearly we tend to think in more structural terms about this. As I said, there are a group of people who constantly are looking for explanations for competitive behavior in international relations that they think doesn't make sense. I would include all defensive realists and a bunch of liberal internationalists and all kinds of it. Is it bureaucratic politics? Is it organizational theory? Is it dumb individuals? Is it aggressive individuals? Daryl and I both kind of view international politics in an inherently kind of offensive realist way that Daryl prefers not to use the term as much as I do, but this is international competition is the default in a world of anarchy and uncertainty and inability to discern intentions and offensive capabilities. And so again, in a way, we're explaining both for all kinds of realists why competition endures, even in the nuclear age. That's the bottom line point that we're making. And again, it's clearly a structural based argument in the end.
Daryl, did you want to add in anything there?
No, I'd like to hear. I'll just wait for another question.
Okay, good. Well, I've got one more here that I see, and again, I encourage people to send in your questions even at the last minute here. A question from Nigel. I'm going to say it wrong. Thalakada. Nigel Thalakada. To what extent can you attribute nuclear competition to organizational level factors? Maybe you've already just answered this. Organizational factors, military bureaucracies, doctrines, then to systemic causes. And I think one of the things that maybe I could add to that is the ideas that were floating around in the 80s that Matthew Evangelista and others, but even Barry Posen, that perhaps the doctrines that were being created during this time period that you talk about, 1970 to 1990 in particular, were perhaps driven more by bureaucratic interest, not the military-industrial complex, but the idea, and this was certainly true in the 50s to some degree, that certain agencies like the Air Force versus the Navy wanted control over certain aspects of the nuclear arsenal, and therefore pushed hard, at least within their own administration, for more funding. And whether that perhaps drove some of the arms racing competition that you talk about. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, let me jump in. It's a great question. To clarify something from way back at the beginning, it is the advocates of the nuclear revolution who spent decades saying the world is not working out the way that we expected. Okay, and when they made that observation, they then answered their own question. When their logic to them seemed so strong and the behavior of the world seemed to be contrary to that, they reached to psychology and misperception. They reached to leaders simply not understanding. They reached for organizational politics. There were a whole, that's right, the interest of the Navy, the interest of the Air Force, to explain all the behavior that seemed discordant with their theory. It's not necessarily that there was a ton of positive evidence linking it. It's that they were kind of stand-in arguments to try to explain something for which they didn't understand the strategic logic. Keir and I have explained the strategic logic. Again, once again, we don't say that this is a good thing or a bad thing. We could talk about that later. We're just saying this is what the United States and Russia and now China, and in a different way, Israel and Pakistan are up to, et cetera. As for the role, though, of organizational politics in this, my guess is there were moments and times when it's true. My guess is when the Air Force was both dominated by bomber pilots and when they controlled, because they controlled the ICBMs, there probably were organizational interests. But what you see over and over again is that the policy was going well beyond what the organizations themselves wanted. There's been a bunch of good historical work showing that the Trident program had to be forced on the Navy. The Navy strongly opposed the development of highly accurate ballistic missiles for reasons we can talk about, which are well understood. All the changes that have happened to the US nuclear force in the past 20 years, which have vastly improved US counterforce capabilities, are things that neither the Air Force nor the Navy give a darn about. It's the change in fuse on the W-88. It's the change in guidance system, right? It's slightly improved ASW systems. It's not building more aircraft carriers, and it's not F-22s or F-35s. It's all this little connective tissue stuff that the United States has done over the past 15 or 20 years that have enhanced our counterforce capabilities while our numbers have shrunk, which are not things that big defense, Boeing doesn't make lots of money on this. Lockheed doesn't make lots of money on this. And the Air Force and the Navy are not clamoring for it. If anything, today the Air Force and the Navy are terrified that their force structure is going to get eaten up by the demands and the costs of nuclear modernization. They are not friends of the nuclear mission. So I think some things you can pin back to a couple organizational interests, particularly the Air Force in the 1950s, but the Navy story, again, is very, very contrary to this, as well as the story of basically everything the United States has done since 1990.
Good, great. Todd asked me to, or suggested that I remind people that the Brendan Green book, which was mentioned as a study of the 1970s nuclear policy, mostly by the U.S., was discussed at the Miller Center last year, and the video is available to people on the website. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so maybe what I can do is see if we can reach some kind of, not middle ground, but perhaps square the circle a little bit here. I'm wondering what you think of this idea, Keir and Daryl, that in terms of military planning, military doctrines, development of weapon systems, the desire to have a strong position, not just an adequate position, but a very strong position, especially for great powers, is clearly a part and parcel of the strategic competition, security competition that has been going on since 45 and didn't really slow down even as actors were developing START treaties and limiting certain weapon systems like ABM and so forth. But that competition kept going. And Brendan Green's book does do a good job on that. I actually read most of it, and it's a good book. What I think the other side of the coin here, though, is this other half, which is the other kinds of behavior that we care about in IR, namely diplomatic in-your-face competitions, coercive standoffs, the kinds of things that Todd and Matt Furman talk about in their book on nuclear coercion, where states literally, 1962, go to the brink to coerce others with nuclear weapons. And you do talk about using nuclear weapons at a coercive level, at a very local sort of battlefield level. And you try to say that there's a case for this. But what I'm wondering, though, is whether you would agree that nuclear deterrence is not just successful in deterring direct attack, it also makes states more cautious in overall foreign policies, makes them more cautious about even regional confrontations, let's say in the South China Sea. It makes China not want to take Natuna Island and go after the Malacca Straits. It makes them just sort of hold back a little bit. And it makes the U.S. less likely to sort of want to be on the road to chicken. And that's another thing. You might not play the game of chicken by keeping your cars or your Mack trucks in the garages. So you may decide, and there's a lot of cases of this, that you're not going to play the nuclear coercion game. And Todd gives a lot of reasons why in his book, because it's so dangerous and not necessarily worth the cost. So that would allow us to square the circle to say that in certain areas of behavior, you're onto something. But in other areas, there is a very different kind of world from the pre-1945 offensive realist, everything is a security competition world. And we only have 2.5 minutes, so thoughts?
2-second thought, which is that, if the United States is acting cautiously, it's got a funny way of showing it, right? In its relations with China, stepping up to basically embracing a Cold War II, containment of China, forward deployed presence. It's not showing it in our alliances with Japan and South Korea, our position toward North Korea, our attitude toward Russia and expanding NATO up to its borders. And so, of course, we agree with if we say that nuclear weapons are the greatest deterrent ever created, that means we're very reluctant to get involved in a war with another nuclear power. It also means that they're going to behave more cautiously if we think that we're about to get involved in that war. But, U.S. policy toward Iran, and if it were to acquire nuclear weapons, it's just hard for me to see why that's as salient a point as maybe I think you would like it to be. I don't see the same kind of effect, but it's a fair point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the most powerful force in geopolitics for the past 30 years has been relative gains concerns. And it completely runs against the notion that the possession of nuclear weapons in some amount protects the core security interests of a country. Relative gains concerns, of course, led us to identify China, rightfully or wrongfully, as the main threat to the United States, despite the fact that their predominant sin is adopting the economic reforms that we urge them to adopt and therefore growing. Relative gains concerns caused the Soviet Union to surrender in the Cold War and eventually dissolve because they realized that within a few years they would not be able to defend themselves from the United States anymore. So yes, it's not that, but on the other hand, there's caution. We thoroughly embrace there's caution and there's deterrence. And yet in the background, countries are competing in the same bare-knuckled hardball fashion. And they're doing so because they're trying to prevent stalemate, escape stalemate, and grab as much for themselves under the condition of stalemate.
Okay.
So nuclear weapons have changed something, just not as much as people hoped.
Well, maybe in the 30 seconds left, I'll just simply say that, first of all, I want to thank the audience for the questions and thank everybody who's been on the Zoom the whole time. I think what we can say here is that there are a lot of policy implications of this book. One obvious aspect, too, is to say under what conditions will states not go full bore on this security competition and indeed allow relative gains like we did for 30 years with the economic aspects of the competition. That was not the full-flown containment logic you'd have in the Cold War. On the other hand, you'd also have other reasons to believe that Keir and Daryl are going to be right under certain conditions. So to me, that's sort of the big research task going forward, is to establish under what conditions you'd want a full-blown security competition, and maybe we're back in it. Under what conditions would you be like the U.S. was with China for 25 years, from 1990 to 2015? So those are, I think, the big research questions. But again, I thank everybody who's been on the talk, and I also thank Keir and Daryl for joining us today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.